I was in university in New Orleans, Louisiana, so long way from here, very different context. And as I started following God, that first year, he communicated with me in some pretty clear ways about what he wanted me to do. And one of the things that he really wanted me to do is he told me very clearly through a number of different people. I felt this when I was in prayer. There were different circumstances in my life that showed me that this is where he wanted me to go. He communicated this to me. Isaac, I want you to preach and teach. That's what I want you to do, mainly. So just start doing it. And my reaction was I was super scared to do that, and I didn't want to do it. So after he communicated this to me, I don't know if you've ever done something like this, I was scared about it for a couple of weeks, and then I just kind of pushed it out of my mind and forgot about it. And didn't do anything with it for months and months. And then as I came up to the end of my time in university, I had all these plans of what I was going to do after university, and one after another, my plans just blew up in my face. And I'm going, what is happening here, God? I'm praying to you about this job that I might get or that job that I might get, and they just everything falls apart everywhere I turn. And so I literally got to the end, like graduation day, and I did not know what I was going to do right after I graduated. I didn't know, should I go home? And so I just spent all this time, I said, God won't tell me what I'm supposed to do. God is just, he's ignoring me now. He won't tell me what's next. He won't open a door for me. And so what I did was, I was very intense then. And so I decided I'm going to take a trip, and I'm just going to spend all this time praying to God. Tell me what I'm supposed to do, God. And so I actually went on this trip across the Southwest. I spent about 2.5, 3 months just driving around in my little 91 Toyota Tercel, which gets good gas mileage and will go forever if you know what you're doing with it. And I would go into the desert, like literally I would go into the desert in Arizona and pray. I would climb up on hills, mountains, and pray, spend the whole night in prayer. And all this time, my main thing was, God, what am I supposed to do? What's next? So I get to Southern California, and I go into this little church. There's like 25 people in a church. And I'm praying in this church, and I'm praying the same prayer. What am I supposed to do, God? What am I supposed to do? What's next? Why won't you tell me what to do? And this guy at the front of the room, he gets up, he takes the microphone. Some of you might have heard this story before. He says, I think God is asking me to have the blonde-haired boy at the back come to the front. I know it's your first time in church. I know it's your first time in our church, but I'd just like to invite you to come up to the front. And I'm like, okay. I had been like crying to God, please tell me what to do. And he gives me the mic and he says, tell us what's the problem. And I said this, the problem is I've been praying for like 3 months, asking God what to do. And, no, I didn't even say that yet. Sorry, I'm messing up the story. So the first thing he says is, here's what God is saying to you. He didn't even hear what I had to say first. He said, here's what God saying to you today. I don't know what the question is you're asking him, but what God is saying to you is this. I already told you what to do, and you're not doing it. And then he says, now what's the problem? And I stood there and cried a lot. And anyway, it was really embarrassing, right? And so I walked out of there and realized that God had told me, he had communicated very clearly to me what I was supposed to do. And I wasn't doing it. And so I had been wandering around, not knowing where I was supposed to go, but really, I already knew. And so immediately after that, I went and did what God was telling me to do. Actually, no, that's not what I did at all. I was still too scared to do it. But over time, I did begin to move in the right direction and have been trying to do what God wants me to do and has asked me to do. So we're in this message series called Heroes of Faith. And what we're doing in this series is we're looking at in the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, there's this list of great people of faith from the past, from the Old Testament, from the Bible. People who did amazing things for God through their trust in him. And so we looked at Abel, right? Cain's brother Abel, and how Abel gave his first and his best to God. We looked at Enoch, who the Bible says walked with God. He desired a relationship with God more than anything else. Each of these people is an example for us of what it looks like to have faith, what it looks like to live a life of trust in God. After that, we looked last week at Noah, who did what God was asking him to do, even though it seemed crazy and no one else in his generation was following God. But he followed God anyway, even though in his generation, he wasn't totally alone, but in his generation, he felt very much alone. And today we're going to look at Abraham. And Abraham followed God even though he didn't know where he was going. God told him what to do, but God didn't tell him where he was going, but he followed God anyway. We're going to start off with just a little introduction video to Abraham, who he is, what's going on. It's about 2 minutes long, so let's watch that, and then we'll keep going with what the Bible says about Abraham.
Second part of Genesis zooms in and focuses on just one family.
And right in the middle is this story that links the two parts of Genesis together and helps us understand what the whole book is all about.
So how do we get from the Tower of Babel to the story here in the middle?
Well, after the scattering at Babel, there's this genealogy, and it follows one of the tribes all the way down to this one guy named Abram.
You probably know him as Abraham.
And God starts making all these promises to Abraham, like he's going to bless him and give him a ton of kids. And he says that through him and his family, all the nations of the earth are now going to find God's blessing. So basically, God is trying to restore humanity back to the goodness of the garden and to his original intentions for the world. So it's like his rescue plan for humanity. And that's why the whole second half of Genesis is about this one family. And so you have Abraham, and then he has his son Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And to each generation, God renews his promise to bless them and all nations through them.
So because of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, it's pretty easy to read these stories as examples of how to be a good person.
But actually, for the most part, this family is totally dysfunctional. So for example, let's go back to Abraham. This whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family, but 2 different times. He basically gives Sarah away to other men by denying that she's even his wife. And then Sarah gets impatient about having a son, and so she makes Abraham sleep with her servant girl, which then causes all of these other problems in the family.
So they get really old, and you begin to think that there's no way they're going to have a kid of their own. But then, miraculously, they do. It's Isaac.
Isn't that a cool video? Yes. Miraculously here. No. So highly recommend those videos. The Bible Project, if you don't know about that, that's a great thing to use actually in some of your family devotion times. If you want to get, they have great overviews of books of the Bible or whole themes that run through the Bible. Fantastic. We'll be using that video a little bit more, some other pieces of it as we move forward through this dysfunctional family that God chose to use to bless the entire world. So as we're moving into this and talking about heroes of the faith, it's important to recognize that these heroes that we hold up are not perfect. In fact, they're not even close to perfect. They're heroes not because they were amazingly perfect and were able to do everything all on their own. They're heroes because even in the midst of all this, all the times they keep messing up and going the wrong way, at the core, they continue to want God more than anything else. And they continue to exercise what the Bible calls faith. They continue to trust God. And then they trust him enough to actually do the things he's asking them to do. That's the key here. And as we get into Abraham, we see the first, we saw a little bit in Noah. Some of these earlier heroes of the faith, we don't know very much about their life. We only know the great things that they did. So it's hard to see that other side where they were no doubt dysfunctional and full of sin also. But when we get to Abraham, we really start to see it. And we're going to see that moving forward in all of these heroes, that they have this side. They're just like us. They mess up all the time, but if they can hold on to faith, if they can keep trusting God and doing the things that he says over a long period of time, then we, just like them, can be used by God to do amazing things in the world in spite of our weaknesses. It is an astonishing reality. So that's Abraham. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read for you. So Abraham's story is found in Genesis starting at chapter 12. We're not going to go there today and read the specific verses because it covers a whole bunch of chapters in Genesis. So what we're going to do is we're going to read a little synopsis of his story that comes in Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter with this list of all these great heroes of faith. And then I'm going to go through and tell you the basic outline story of Abraham's life, which I think is going to be really helpful to us. We're going to see how he obeyed God, even though he messed up over and over again. And we're going to kind of hold those two things in tension. We're going to see why God was able to use him, and then we're going to draw a few lessons out of his life. So let's look first in Hebrews chapter 11. So this will be starting at verse 8. This is what it says about Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and he went. That's important. Even though he did not know where he was going. Wow. He obeyed and went even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country, which is exactly what he was. Not just like that, he was a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, so that's his son and his grandson, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So he's looking forward to the promise of God, not to what he can have in this life. And by faith, even Sarah, that's his wife, Abraham's wife, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. That is, she trusted God. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. In fact, from this one man came the nation of Israel. And from that nation would eventually come Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord Jesus Christ, who has saved the world. And from him would come the church, and what all of history was affected. Abraham is a world shaper, even though he's totally dysfunctional. Let's see how he did it. So the story of Abraham, the first point to write down in your bulletin is this. I've said it a couple times, but if you want to fill in the blanks, it's this. You got to follow God, even when you don't know where you're going. And that is the situation for us many times as we try to live by faith. We know what God has asked us to do, but we don't know what the results of it are going to be. We don't know what it's going to look like in the end. And in fact, the great dreams we have, as we're going to see, many of those might not come to pass in this life, even if they are things God plans for us in the end. So here's the story of Abraham. Let's outline his life. So Abraham was from what we would call today Mesopotamia, right? So the region, Ur of the Chaldeans is what they call it in the Bible days. And this is a region sort of between two rivers that is today in the country of Iraq. This is where he started off. His family lineage comes from this area. And it seems like a call. In those days, everyone was worshiping different idols and not living for the one true God. As we talked about last week, this is after the flood and Noah, and the world has now been repopulated. But very quickly, the world goes downhill again. And there are sort of these evil empires that have risen up, right? The evil empire in Babylon and the evil empire in Egypt, who are really living for godless demons, sort of really evil gods that they live for. And Abraham's family begins to receive a call from the one true God. And that's a key here. That's sort of where the story begins. It actually doesn't begin with Abraham. It begins with his dad. If you read the account in Genesis, it's clear that Abraham's dad is actually the first one who hears this call to go to a new land. leave the place where you're at and go to this new land that I'm going to show you where it is. And there we're going to use your family to do amazing things. The video talked about it as a rescue plan. It's the beginning of God's rescue plan for the world, for the human race. And it begins with Abraham's dad. But the sad thing is that Abraham's dad only goes halfway. Abraham's dad begins to follow this call that he hears from this God that he doesn't really know. But some hard things come in his life, and it seems too difficult. And he goes halfway and he gets stuck and he doesn't move. And so the story then really has to begin again with Abraham. And we're going to come back to this idea later because many are called and few are chosen. That's a quote from Jesus. God is calling to many of us in the world, but the question is, are we going to actually be the ones to respond to the call? And he's not going to make us. And sometimes hard things come in life, and those things can prevent us from believing, from having enough faith and trust that God is actually going to use us, that God is actually going to fulfill his promise. And that's what happened with Abraham's dad. So Abraham is living in this sort of halfway place, kind of between where the family started out and where they're supposed to go. And he lives there for a long time. Now, people lived a lot longer back then than they do today, but Abraham doesn't actually himself start to respond to the call of God until he's 75 years old. Okay? He waited even longer than me, okay, with my not doing what God had asked me to do when I was graduating from college. But he eventually responds to this call. I think this builds up on him over time, and we see there in Hebrews 11, it says he heard God was calling him, go to a new place. I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And I'm going to use that nation to bless the whole world. I'm going to give you this land that I'm going to show you where it is. So Abraham gears up his courage and he says, I'm going to do this. And he gets his family and he goes away from everything that he knows. And you got to realize in those days, this was a much scarier thing than it is today. To go to a new place. Like, not only do they not have the internet to go and search, what is the land of Canaan like where I'm going to go? They don't even have maps yet. Maps had never been invented. So how do I even get to this land where I'm going? I have to just wander with my tents and my goats and my family, and God is going to somehow directly tell me, go here, go there. I'm not sure how I'm going to know. He's going to wander around not knowing where he's going. And also, there's no laws. This place where he's going is just a bunch of little kingdoms and tribes and warlords that rule a local area. And it's just him. I mean, he's got a pretty extensive household, so maybe it's, there's 100 of them or something like that, people that are with him. He has servants. He fights a war at one point. It's a very small war with his servants and his extended family. But this is a scary thing to do. He's going to be around people who have armies, and he's never met them and knows nothing about them. So he takes this leap of faith. And I'm sure he receives this vision at the beginning, and I'm sure he thought, man, this is going to be amazing. God's going to build a nation out of me. So what would be the logical conclusion? I'm probably going to have tons of kids. God's going to bless me. My wife and I are going to be very productive, and we're going to have this massive army of young men who are growing up in our household. And we're going to be safe. He's going to give us this land. That probably means he's going to drive out all these other people that are scary to me and might kill me. And he goes, and 25 years later, he doesn't have a single child. 25 years later, when his wife is now 90. You saw that picture, was pretty funny, right? They got really old. His wife is now 90. They don't have a single child. And they don't have a single square foot of land that's their own. They're just wandering around, hoping that the people in the lands where they're going let them stay there and don't kill them. And this is why we saw some of the bad stuff that he does. He certainly does some stuff that's motivated by fear. But it's because he's in these situations where, here's a local warlord king. And this king's got an army. And here I am with my little family, and his wife, the text seems to indicate again and again that Sarah, his wife, is extremely attractive. She's really, really pretty, even though she's older than we would think of as being, the age for marrying and all that sort of thing. But maybe it was a little bit different back then. She's extremely attractive, and he's got a legitimate fear that the soldiers and the warriors and the little warlords in these lands are going to come kill him and take his wife. And that's the fear that he keeps responding to. This happens twice, where he pretends that it's just my sister, so don't kill me. And then, of course, they say, well, she's just your sister. Well, she's really hot, so I'm going to marry her. And then God has to intervene and save him, and God does intervene and save him. So throughout the story, God is showing up and doing stuff, but it's not the stuff that Abraham is thinking God's going to do. Yeah, he wants God to protect him, but Abraham's thinking, I just want God to come and do this whole plan that he said he was going to do. Just boom, make it happen. But year after year after year, it doesn't happen. And finally, there's this place where I think it's the climax of Abraham. Am I going to keep going following after God, or am I going to give up? Am I going to trust that God's finally going to give me this child after all this time? Or am I going to give up? Maybe I should go back to my own homeland, my country where I came from, where I was safe, where I had a house, I was secure. And God tells him again, I'm going to give you a son. He's in prayer one day. He says, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham believes God. And this is the pattern in his life. And this is why Abraham is able to be used by God even though he's messed up and dysfunctional. Because when God makes promises to Abraham, Abraham consistently says, I trust that you're going to do that. I don't yet see how it's going to happen. It doesn't make any sense. How can we have a kid? Sarah's like way past menopause. Like she can't have kids anymore. I'm like 100 years old. It doesn't make any sense, but I do hear you saying we're going to have a child. So I believe you're going to do it. And this happens over and over with different things in his life. Even after they have the child, they miraculously have Isaac. And then many of you know this story that comes later is God tests him again. And God says to him, okay, you've got this one child. I told you I'm going to make a great nation out of you. So many people that it would be more than the sand on the seashore, your descendants. So far you've got one. And God says, I want you to get rid of him. I want you to sacrifice that one. And Abraham is able, even in that moment, through all his dysfunction, to say to God, I trust that you're still going to fulfill your promise. I'm going to listen to what you're saying right now, even though I don't see how it's going to work out. And it makes no sense to me. I know that your way is going to be better in the end. It's an amazing act of faith that Abraham is able to do again and again. And so here's what we want to, the second point for your bulletins that I want to bring across to us today for us to consider about his life and then think about how we can emulate and follow is this. Abraham hears what God is asking him to do, and then he does it. This is the core of what faith looks like in Abraham's life, and actually this is the core of what faith is. Because if we say we believe God, if we say, yes, I believe in Jesus, I trust him, but then there's this thing in my life, like I had, that God is asking me to do, and I'm not doing it, I don't actually have faith. I might think I do. I might try to convince myself that I do. My friends might think I do because I'm reading my Bible consistently and praying. But if I'm not doing the things that God is asking me to do, I don't really trust him. It's not that God won't let me have faith or he somehow is disqualifying me if I don't do these things. It's not that it's the things that I do that earn my place with God. That's not the case at all. It's simply this, that if I'm not doing what God is asking me to do, I don't trust him. Let's say you went to your doctor and your doctor said, you have this really bad disease and here's the treatment that you need to do. And you said no. Do you trust your doctor? Obviously not. You simply don't trust them if you don't do what they say to do. And this is also the case with faith. If we don't do what God is asking us to do, it's simply true that we don't trust him. So the core of faith, even though it seems so simple, is that Abraham hears what God is asking him to do. He doesn't always do it immediately. Sometimes in the text, it reads as if it happens immediately. I think some of these things took him a long time. Later on in his life, he's grown in faith and he's able to do it faster and faster. But eventually, Abraham always does what God is asking him to do. And that's why God is able to use him, for that one simple reason. He is called a man of faith because he does what God has asked him to do. The second thing to consider about how Abraham proceeds in his life is this, and this is the third point in your bulletin. He keeps on doing what God has asked him to do for a long time. Sometimes we look at the Bible and we think, man, I wish that what happens in the Bible would happen in my life. Like God talks to Abraham. If you read through Genesis, like every chapter, God is talking to him and telling him different things and encouraging him. And we look at that from our perspective and think, wow, man, I wish that would happen in my life. God never talks to me. Man, it's been like 10 years since God said something to me. I don't even know when God is talking to me. Well, the thing is, what we read in the Bible about Abraham, man, this happens over 25, 35, 45 years. God is not talking to Abraham like every day. This stuff happens that, like I said, he heard from God and then he followed God doing this same thing for 25 years before he hears from God the second time. 25 years. It's just like me in my time after college, right? I had heard from God, and then because I hadn't heard from him in a really clear way that I understood for a few months, I started whining and complaining. God doesn't talk to me. Oh, poor me. He doesn't like me. He's ignoring me. He wasn't ignoring me. I was ignoring him. And this is what happens to us again and again. God communicates to us, but we don't follow through. We don't do it, or we don't even recognize maybe that he's communicating to us in some ways. Or we start following, but like Abraham's dad, things get hard and we give up. And what we needed to do was hold on to our faith and keep on going. Abraham keeps doing what God has asked him to do for a long time. Community of Hope Church, we could think about this with respect to our church, right? Some of us have been here for what seems like a long time. 10, 11, 12 years, some of us. And at the beginning of this thing, we felt called. We felt called to plant a church that would then start planting other churches. And over the years, many of us have thought, why hasn't it happened? We planted one church a long way away, but we haven't seen our church planting the other churches that we thought God was calling to us to at the beginning. And some of us have started to think at different points in that time, maybe we were wrong. Maybe that wasn't what God called us to. Don't think that. It's just like Abraham. Do you see it? We have to keep going. We see part of the answer. We see good things happening, and that's God in our midst showing us that he's eventually going to fulfill the promise. But these promises, sometimes we don't see the whole thing. Maybe even in our time here, whether our time here at this church or our time here on this earth, we might not see the promise fulfilled the way we thought it was going to be fulfilled at the beginning. But that doesn't mean we were wrong. It means we got to keep going. It means we got to exercise our faith. Right now we're at this place where we're having a transition, right? Pastor Philip has stepped down as the lead pastor of Community of Hope, and maybe as a church there are some ways we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like for us. But just like Abraham trusted God when he didn't know where he was going, so we must trust God even if we can't see all the particulars of what it will look like over the next few years. We got to trust him and keep going. Now, I want to dig into this as we move toward the end of the message here. I want to dig into this idea that we need to do what God is asking us to do. Because even as simple as that seems, and we talk about it again and again, as simple as that seems, that is the major problem. That is the major problem in the world today. It is the major problem in the church. It is the major problem in the life of basically every Christian. is that we hear things from God, but we don't actually do them. I'll tell you a story about a guy named Dallas Willard. How many of you guys know that name? I've said that name a bunch of times, a few people. He passed away a few years ago, 2015, I think, but he was a professor of philosophy at University of Southern California, and he was also for a long time, for like 40 years, something like that. And he was also, he was a pastor, very devoted Christian, and he became, especially toward the end of his life, an amazing role model for tons of pastors. And actually his books have inspired maybe a real shift in the direction of the church in North America, actually, I think. He's a man who was being listened to, especially at the end of his life, by millions of people, really. And he would go to these conferences. His whole thing was about how do we grow in Christ? How do we actually become more like God? How does that work? Instead of just saying we believe in Jesus and then being stuck there, not growing and becoming actually more and more like Jesus, how do we make sure that we become more like him? How does the church become what she was made to be? That's what his whole focus was on. So he would have these conferences. And at one of these conferences, there was this climactic moment in the conference where he was answering questions. And somebody asked him a really simple question. They said, okay, you've written these whole books. He wrote like an 800-page, maybe it's not that long, 500-page book on how to become more like Christ. You've written all this stuff, but let's just break it down real simply. If someone actually wants to move forward, if someone wants to grow, but they don't know how to become more like Jesus, what should they do? Like, what's the first step? And he paused. He paused for like 15 seconds, which is a long time if you're up front. I won't pause for that long because you'll feel really awkward if I do. And I'll feel even more awkward. And it was silent in this whole auditorium of like probably at least 2,000 pastors and leaders. And then he said just this. They should do the next right thing that they know they ought to do. And everybody was like, what? That's it? That was his whole answer. If someone really wants to grow, and that's your fourth point in your bulletin, if someone really wants to grow, what do you do? It seems so complicated, it's so hard. You should do the next right thing that you know you ought to do. Whatever that is. But there are so many things that stop us from doing the next right thing, even when we know it. There's our own fears. Sometimes, like me in that story at the beginning, you're just afraid to do the thing that God has asked you to do. It seems impossible, and you've convinced yourself that you can't. Sometimes we convince ourselves that we can't because of our circumstances, because we have false beliefs. Think about Abraham. Think about how many different reasons he could have thrown up for why he can't leave his home country and go off into the wilderness. I can't. I have a family to take care of. And if I just go wandering around the desert, my family might get killed. So I can't follow God. I can't because I need like a stable place to live. Isn't that a basic human right? I shouldn't be wandering around in tents all my life. I can't. I can't go become this great nation because I can't even have kids. It's impossible. There are so many reasons Abraham could have clung to and said, I can't do it. But instead, Abraham pushed all those aside because really when it comes down to it, most of the time, those reasons are excuses for us. Because really deep down, we don't want to do the thing that we know we ought to do. We might also just feel overwhelmed by so many things that are in front of us. And I think that's where the power of Dallas Willard's statement comes. You don't have to do all the things. The answer to how do I become like Jesus is not do everything in the Bible. It's just do the next thing. That's it. The next thing that you know is the right thing for you to do, just do that next thing. Don't worry about the 10,000 things that might come after that. Just work on that one. And so as we're in this season right now where we're trying in our community groups to move forward in having role models and mentors, we spent a ton of time in the fall talking about mentoring relationships. And that's a big part of what's supposed to be happening right now in your community groups. So whether you're a community group leader or you're a community group member or you're not in a community group yet and now you're thinking, whoa, I really want to be in a community group, because that sounds awesome, and it is awesome. A big part of the focus of those groups is to help us figure out the answer to this question. What is the next thing that God is asking me to do? And then, what's preventing me from doing it? And how can I become like Abraham and just do it? Because the whole history of the world, do you see how the history of the world depended on Abraham exercising this faith? I've been struck again and again today by the Spirit of God telling me the same thing in different ways. We often, as the church, we are forgetting who we are. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. God has decided that the future history of the world will depend on you and me. That's what He's decided. On those who have been called and who have decided to follow the call to pursue Jesus, the future history of Surrey and North Delta and the world depends not just on God, but on us. Isn't that freaky? It is to me, and it should be to you. And it is essential that we learn how to do the next thing that we ought to do. There are lots of ways we can figure out what that thing is. If you feel like me, if you're the kind of person who feels like, I don't know what it is that I'm supposed to do, you probably already do, and you just don't realize it, or you have forgotten. And you're going to need other people in your life to help call that out of you and see what that thing is. But once you've seen it, I want to encourage you today to simply do it. The future history of the world, my friends, my brothers and sisters, depends on us. Let's be like Abraham. Let's pray now as we continue in worship.